Okay, so we're going to continue today in the book of Judges, Judges chapter 8. So if you're following along in your Bible, now if you have a non-NIV Bible, that would be ideal today because there's going to be a weird translation thing that's going to happen later on. And I'm going to ask someone to read something out of a non-NIV Bible. But we're in Judges chapter 8 today. We're going to be looking at the last bit of Gideon's story, right? And so if you've been with us, you know I was kind of hard on Gideon. I think deservedly so, but then we talked about last week where he had the decision time. Finally, things came down to it. He was down to the wire. He had to make a decision. Was he going to finally put his full faith in God or not? And then he chooses, of course, to do it. And I think that is why when we read in the book of Hebrews, we read about this great hero of faith because he did. I mean, let's face it. He had to take out a big step of faith to take 300 men down to go do this crazy plan against 135,000. Crazy. And if you remember at the end of that story, we had Gideon had began to set them to rout. They were beginning to run away. There was chaos. They were killing each other. And they began to run away. And in fact, they were able to catch two of the captains, which they killed. But the pursuit is not over. And not only that, he called out to his brothers and sisters in Ephraim as well to come join them. And it starts with this in chapter 8, verse 1. Now the Ephraimites asked Gideon, so this is after the first battle. They finally meet up with each other, and they said, "Why have you treated us like this? Why didn't you call us when you went to fight Midian?" And they challenged him vigorously. And if you remember, that's because when he originally sent out the original missives out to gather troops, right, the original army that was gathered, he only sent letters out to Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. That was back in Judges chapter 6. And we're going to have a map in just a minute. And you'll notice that Ephraim is right there where the battle happens. So they're saying, "Hey, Gideon, you're on our front porch. Why didn't you even ask us to come help? What's going on?" And Gideon answered them. Now, I don't know if this is it doesn't say whether or not he's still kind of under the influence of the Spirit or what's going on here, but we know that this is his response. It says, what have I accomplished compared to you? Aren't the gleanings of Ephraim's grapes better than the full grape harvest of Abiezer? God gave Oreb and Zeb, those were the two captains, to the Midianite leaders into your hands. That's Ephraim. What was I able to do compared to you? And at this, their resentment against him subsided. Now, you'll notice later on, we're going to get to it. What he's talking about here, yeah, they took the 300 men, right? So he's talking about his little tribe that went there and the little group of 300 that he had. Sure, they caused a little bit of chaos. But when Ephraim went ahead of them and grabbed the Jordan, got control of the Jordan River and began to slaughter the Midianites as they approached, the slaughter was so intense that the remaining force was only 15,000 men. Now, if you went from 135,000 to 15,000, you could say, yeah, clearly Ephraim had a big chunk of what happened in this event. And so I think somehow this subsides them. I don't get it. Maybe it's the Lord speaking to their hearts. However, what Gideon is telling them is they are the mighty warriors this day. Of all the tribes of Israel that showed up to fight, it is Ephraim that does the most mighty deeds of this day. And so, yeah, could you put up, it says Gideon's route on the thing? And I did this because I don't know how you guys are, but I read about these things and I go, where on earth is this stuff? And I like using maps and pictures because that's my brain. I'm simple. And so this is where they were up here at the top of the arrows. And you'll see right here, clearly you can read this because it's not at all fuzzy. And it says the spring of Herod. So you remember they said that they were, that's actually where Gideon did the test, right? They went to the spring of Herod, and that's this river. It goes from here all the way down to the Jordan River. And so this is where the original kind of fighting had taken place. This is the hill of Moloch where they were, or not Moloch, Morith, where they were camped. They came down into this valley, boom, scared them all, and then they ran over here to the Jordan, and you'll notice, big Manasseh here, Ephraim right here, so they are fleeing down the Jordan River. Why down the Jordan River? Because if you had a bigger map that showed you even more, you would notice that Midian is actually all the way to the south, all the way at the bottom of Israel, down below the Dead Sea. So they are booking it, trying to get out of there and get home. And of course, who do they have to go through? They have to go through Ephraim. And that's exactly what Gideon was talking about here. Now, this is all going to be important because we're going to be talking about a few other places that come up here as well. So it says, Gideon and his 300 men, exhausted, yet keeping up in pursuit. Okay, so they're still chasing. They're giving it. I'm not sure if you noticed, but that map was a big distance, and they're still going. They're giving it. Keeping up the pursuit, they came to the Jordan and crossed it. And he said to the men of Succoth, and it was on that map as well. It was one of the little towns on the way south of the Jordan. And he said to the men of Succoth, give my troops some bread. They are worn out, and I am still pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian. All right, so, and this is obviously really important because if you want to stop this invading force, if you want to stop this from happening to future generations, then as you've probably most often heard, you want to take out the snake by the head. You don't want to just, nip the troops in the bud and leave the kings alive, because then they're going to come back with vengeance. But now they're instead trying to capture the kings so that they can stop them once and for all. However, in verse 6 it says, the officials of Succoth said, this is what I'm saying. If you have a non-NIV Bible, this might help, because I see a little cringe, and you probably read it there, Hannah, and it sounds weird. Do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in your possession? Why should we give bread to your troops? Now, this is what I said, why this is a weird translation thing. What does that make you think they're asking? Yeah. Did you cut off their hands, and do you have them in your possession? And yet, does someone have a non-NIV translation? I saw you flip there, but I wasn't sure if you had one. But in every other, like if you read King James, New King James, ESV, all the other main ones, ASV, NRSV, stuff like that, they will all say instead, are they in your hands, Gideon? And then, of course, when we read something like that, we go, oh, okay, I understand. If someone is in your hand, we recognize that as in your power, right? So, bit of a confusing way to word it. Don't know why they chose that, but whatever. They're humans, they make mistakes, I suppose. So these officials of Succoth are saying, hey, who are you that we should give you bread? Do you already do you have power over them? Now, why are they saying this? Because of course they're afraid. For how long was it that we've been talking about now? Like at least 20 years? No, it was 7 years that they were raiding them. Every year they would come in, raid them, steal everything they had. Right? So fears, of course, come in. No one's been able to stand up to them in all this time. And suddenly, this guy, Gideon, shows up and says, hey, give my men some food. We're 300 chasing, if you remember, 15,000, and we're going to go get them. I mean, I can understand why they didn't put much faith, but what, of course, they weren't putting faith in wasn't just Gideon, but also God and what God was able to accomplish, right? Because they had already sent missives ahead, the people in Ephraim, the people in Manasseh, in Naphtali, and Zebulun, and Asher. They all knew that this was a call that Gideon had on his life from the Lord. And now, whether by human revenge or anger or whatever, this is what Gideon says. Just for that, so the guys refused to give them bread. And he says, just for that, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, I will tear your flesh with desert thorns and briars. And then from there, it says he went up. Now, when we read a map, we tend to think of up as north, but he actually goes south across another river. And right across the river is this other town, Peniel, whatever. But it's basically just across the river, and he makes the same request of them. But they answered as the men of Succoth had. So he said to the men of Peniel, when I return in triumph, I will tear down this tower. Once again, we see the power of fear causing people, even though they knew that God had called them, even though they knew God was doing something great. And it's not like the judges, there weren't other judges before that God had raised up and done amazing things for. So it's not like they didn't have any reason to believe. But for whatever reason, fear caused them to instead side with Midian, because maybe if we don't supply these men and these kings get away, then maybe Midian will show us mercy because we didn't actually help. We didn't help these guys go and attack them. So instead, they end up getting this weird promise from Gideon instead that he will tear down their tower. Verse 10, now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor with a force of about 15,000 men. That was all that was left of the armies of the eastern peoples. 120,000 swordsmen had fallen. That is... And remember, what did he do this with? He had 300 men. He caused a load of distraction. A bunch of them killed each other, and a bunch of them got killed by the Ephraimites when they were trying to retreat and get down by the Jordan. They were met there with swords. They had lost almost all of their force. And then it says Gideon went up by the route of the nomads. This is important because he's not going up the normal way that you would expect. He's not taking the merchant route. He's not taking the route that the armies would have taken, the more convenient way, staying close to water. But instead, he takes a nomad path out and around in a more secretive fashion. And he took it east of Nobah and Jogbaha and attacked the unexpecting army, those 15,000 men, with, once again, only 300 men. Zebah and Zalmunna, the two kings of Midian, fled, but he pursued them and captured them, routing their entire army. So we know at least some of their army survived, whether it was by panic when these men suddenly showed up once again from an unexpected side, right? They probably were getting further south. Okay, let's gather our strength. Let's get ready. These guys are still coming. They were probably forming up, getting ready for an assault from the north. And what ends up happening? Wait, they get attacked from the east? They're not expecting that. They're not ready. And it puts rout into them. But of course, the two kings of Midian are captured in this battle. Then it says, verse 13, Gideon, son of Joash, then returned from the battle by the pass of Heres. All you need to know is that there's a lot of mountains along that ridge and that this is one of the safe ways to get back across. And he caught a young man of Succoth and questioned him, and the young man wrote down for him the names of the 77 officials of Succoth, the elders of the town. And then Gideon came and said to the men of Succoth, here are Zebah and Zalmunna, to whom you taunted me by saying, do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in your possession? Why should we give bread to your exhausted men? And this is probably the strangest part of Gideon's whole story. Then it says he took the elders of the town and he taught the men of Succoth a lesson by punishing them with desert thorns and briars. I think the NIV puts it much more mildly. If you read something like the King James, it says he literally tore their flesh with the desert thorns, right? Like, this wasn't, and he ends up killing them, but this is all 77? 77 officials of Succoth. He comes good on that promise that he made. He said that he would do this if they did not feed them. They refused to feed them. And they got exactly what he said. He also pulled down the tower of Peniel and killed the men of that town. This is one of those things that as I read this part of the story, I always go, wait a minute, is this still under the power of God? Is this judgment because of their lack of faith? Because we have seen that several times, haven't we? The reason that all of this is happening is because of, once again, they have fallen away from the worship of God. Instead are worshiping the Baals, worshiping Asherah, worshiping other gods. And it introduces to them this weakness that ends up corrupting their hearts. It ends up making them weak, and then that way when the Lord does call, suddenly they're no longer willing to be rallied. They forget the power of God, the power that brought them up out of Egypt. Then it says that they asked Zebah and Zalmunna, what kind of men did you kill? Now, this is another strange part of the story. What kind of men did you kill at Tabor? And they responded, men like you, each one with the bearing of a prince. Gideon replied, those were my brothers, the sons of my own mother, and as surely as the Lord, you'll notice it's got that weird thing because that's once again Jehovah, as surely as the Lord lives, if you have spared their lives, I would not kill you. Then turning to Jether, his oldest son, he said, kill them. But Jether did not draw his sword because he was only a boy and he was afraid. Right? So if you remember going back to Exodus, we know, and the Jewish laws and customs, we know that a boy of 12 years old was considered a man. He was man enough to go to war. He was man enough to work for the family, to do all these things. You had full responsibility at 12. But of course, can you imagine as a 12-year-old boy, young boy here, suddenly being told, kill these men who are tied up, right? These are not men that are coming against you in combat or anything like these. They are captives. So I can understand this poor child's hesitation. But what's interesting is, of course, their response in verse 21. Zebah and Zalmunna say, come, do it yourself. As is the man, so is his strength. They goad him. They taunt him. Which doesn't seem like a wise thing to do when you're a captive, and right now your captors are showing a little bit of hesitation. Maybe they won't kill you. Maybe I could get out of this. You probably shouldn't taunt them. But instead he taunts them, and so it says Gideon stepped forward and killed them. And then he took, and again, remember, weird details mean it's coming up later. And then he took the ornaments off their camels' necks. Why? Just you wait. Then it says, the Israelites said to Gideon, rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian. Now, I think Gideon is still being good Gideon at this point. We got good Gideon, and we got bad Gideon. We've had bad Gideon for a lot, and then all of a sudden he takes this transformation. He's like, yeah, and he's good Gideon, and he's listening to God, he's obeying God, he's listening to the will of God, even when things are difficult, right? Like, I can't imagine, even if it was just a force of 15,000, taking 300 up against that, I wouldn't feel too secure about it, and yet Gideon does so all the same. And here, once again, he's being good Gideon because, once again, as the Israelites keep doing time and time again, even though they are in a land to be free, to no longer have to serve any man, any master, the only one that they live under the authority of is God. That's it. That's the only one. That was the point of getting freedom from slavery from Egypt, that you no longer had to serve a human master, that the only one you were subject to, the only one that had authority over you anymore was God, and that you would live a life in service to God. And yet time and time again, they keep saying, rule over us to the next mighty person, because as is still very apparent today, so often people value safety and security over freedom and faith. But Gideon, being good Gideon, tells them that he will not rule over them, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. And he said, I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder, because it was the custom of the Ishmaelites to wear earrings. And if you remember, Ishmael was, of course, the brother of Isaac, all the way back with Abraham. And so these were, the eastern peoples were Ishmael's descendants. In a weird way, they're long-lost cousins. And it was their custom to wear golden earrings. And so in verse 25, they answered, we'll be glad to give them. So they spread out a garment, and each of them threw in a ring from his plunder onto it. And the weight of the gold rings he asked for came to 700 shekels, which is roughly 43 pounds of gold, which is roughly $1 million today. Right? So can you imagine that, though? All of a sudden, so they just say, they spread out this cloak. I don't know anyone, really. I don't know anyone that I respect so much that I would just be ready to just hand over $1 million worth of gold. However, the point of all this is to show you just how committed they were to Gideon at this point. They had seen Gideon do amazing things. They had witnessed the power of God that has been using Gideon come through to accomplish this great feat. They are finally lifted out of their oppression. They're no longer under the heel of these two kings. In fact, now that these two kings are dead, you're looking at an entire generation before they could possibly rally together and put together a force to ever come back at them again. Gideon has done this great thing for them. And so they're so excited that they give him 700 shekels, 43 pounds of gold. And that does not include the ornaments, right? So this is just in earrings. I don't know about you, but earrings are pretty small. I keep thinking to myself, how big was this pile of earrings? Because they don't weigh very much either. They're fairly light. Otherwise, they'd rip your ear off. But it did not include the ornaments, the things that were on the camels' necks. And if you remember, they said that there were so many camels in this army that they couldn't even count them. It didn't include the ornaments, the pendants, the purple garments that were worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains that were on their camels' necks as well. Gideon went from being a humble farmer to the richest man in all of Israel in a moment. And of course, this is where Gideon stops being good Gideon and starts becoming bad Gideon again. Then it says in verse 27, Gideon made the gold into an ephod. We've read that before. Which he placed in Ophrah, his town. All of Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there. And it became a snare to Gideon and his family. This, of course, has a lot of similarity with two stories, both of them out of Exodus. One, of course, I think is easy for us to reconcile is the golden calf, right? Suddenly, they get all this gold volunteered by the people of Israel, and then what do? They fashion it into something that they begin to bow down and worship. Once again, we see this weird compulsion that people have where they need to have some sort of icon to focus their worship to instead of just worshiping God for who he is. The second thing is, it's a very specific icon that they create. It's an ephod, a golden ephod, which, if you know the book of Exodus, you'll have read before. It's in Exodus 28. And it's, if you're looking at it in your Bible, there's a subtitle that says, The Priestly Garments. I'm going to read the first 6 verses. 28 Exodus 28, verse 1. Have Aaron your brother brought to you from among the Israelites along with his sons, Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar and Ithamar, so that they may serve me as priests. Make sacred garments for your brother Aaron to give him dignity and honor. He gets special garments. And what are they? Tell all the skilled workers of whom I have given wisdom, right? These were if you remember when God called them to make the temple and make all the things, they were like, well, we don't have any tradesmen. And God said, don't worry, I'm going to take care of that. And he blessed them with the knowledge and skill of master craftsmen. He says, tell the skilled workers whom I have given wisdom in such matters that they are to make garments for Aaron for his consecration, so he may serve me as priest. There are garments, these are the garments they are to make: a breastpiece, an ephod, a robe, a woven tunic, a turban, and a sash. They are to make these sacred garments, once again, for your brother Aaron and his sons, so they may serve me as priest. And who was Aaron? Aaron wasn't just any priest, he was I heard someone say it, but it was very quiet because people are scared. I'm very scary, I understand. The high priest, right? Aaron was the high priest. He was the priest of all the priests. In fact, when it came to the Holy of Holies, the only one who would ever, under any circumstances, be permitted to even go in there was the high priest. And even then, it was very difficult to get in. And then it said, have them use gold and blue and purple and scarlet yarn and fine linen. Why? These are things of royalty. And then verse 6, make the ephod of gold, very similar to what, right? Blue and purple and scarlet yarn of finely twisted linen, the work of skilled hands. And it goes on further to explain more about this golden ephod, what it was used for, how it was used. But most importantly, it was used by the high priest. It was used to identify him, to show his consecration, that he has been set apart and made holy, that he is there to be in service to God. And what does Gideon do? But decides, I'm going to have one as well. And of course, this is what ends up leading Israel to go astray eventually, once again, because instead of going back to the priestly worship where the temple was set up, right, the tent temple that they had set up, instead of sending them back and doing this, suddenly they had a second priestly caste set up in Ophrah. Then it says, thus Midian, verse 28, this is back in Judges. Thus Midian was subdued before the Israelites and did not raise its head again. During Gideon's lifetime, the land had peace for 40 years. Jerubbaal, Gideon, son of Joash, went back home to live, and he had 70 sons of his own, for he had many wives. I don't know how many wives you need to have 70 sons. 70 sons, that doesn't include daughters. How many kids did this guy have? Obviously, life was good for Gideon. His concubine, who lived in Shechem, also bore him a son, whom he named Abimelech. Gideon, son of Joash, died at the good old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. Then no sooner had Gideon died than the Israelites again prostituted themselves to the Baals. They set up Baal Berith as their god, and they did not remember the Lord their God, who had rescued them again from the hands of all their enemies on every side. They also failed to show any loyalty to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in spite of all the good things that he has done for them. See, this is why I'm never as enamored as some people are with the story of Gideon, because I see how it ends, and I always take that ending as such a warning for myself as well. Right? The first part of the story, each and every one of us can relate to that. Right? Gideon, he has a lot of flaws, a lot of mistakes, but God's going to use who he wants to use. Okay, that's great. That means that I don't have to be perfect, and God will use me, and he can fill me, and he can make me who he needs me to be. This is great. This is good news. And not only that, then when you start doing these good things, then God is going to do amazing things, miraculous things, things that would be impossible without him. This is great news. The trouble is sometimes we get a little too sure of ourselves. And then we end up like old Gideon, who ends up falling away from the way that God sets out for him and instead sets up an idol in his own family. That ends up leading the people of Israel once again astray, and they forget. Sometimes we think we've made it. I finally, I've come to church, I've made my peace with God, okay, things are good, things are getting along well, and now I can just coast through life. But no. We have to make sure that each and every day, each and every week that we come together, every day when we have to sit down and examine ourselves and our hearts, we have to say, why am I doing what I am doing, right? Because we talked about this before, and we see this in the Kings and the Chronicles, when we see there were kings that did amazing things, great things, good things for the kingdom of Israel and for God, and yet God says they're evil. Why? Because if you do the right thing with evil intent, you're still evil. Just because you do the right thing doesn't mean that your heart's right with God. Right? We need to make sure that our intent is right. Why are we doing what we're doing? Because we want to serve God. That we put God above all else. And that God is most important. I'm sure when Gideon put together this golden ephod fashioned in the style after, the high priest, maybe he thought he was even doing honor to God. Look, I value God so much, I'm going to do this thing. And yet, look at what it ends up doing. That's why it's so important for us to constantly examine ourselves, because there's that old doctrine of once saved, always saved. Well, I just look at the story of Gideon and I say, once saved can fall away. And we need to make sure that we examine that in our own hearts and our own lives.